All right, thanks for coming. I don't know if you saw my Slack this morning. This was going to be kind of a follow-on to like the North Pole, kind of the South Pole, geography, history, data and science. And 3-day weekends are bad, I guess, for me because I just got going on the history and the geography part, especially the history part, and realized that I had way too much. And then I thought about trying to squeeze things in and cut these out. And I decided at the last minute I'm doing my Peter Jackson with The Hobbit, going from 2 parts to 3 parts. So this is being split into 2 parts. So it is only geography and history. So I apologize. This is like a DAX scientist seminar. It should be science, but it's probably not going to be a lot of science. So if you're not interested, if you want, like, oh, forget it, then you feel free to leave, or those online, don't log off. But hopefully this will be somewhat interesting, and we'll get to the science in the next one. I'll schedule that soon. So I came up with the idea of going south as the alternative to the North Pole one, and that phrase popped in my head, and I was like, where did that come from? And for some reason, this movie popped, or I looked and it was this movie, and I was like, I don't really remember this movie, but Jack Nicholson's in it, and John Belushi. Oops, I misspelled John Belushi there. So it didn't get great reviews, but it is, and it has nothing to do with Antarctica or anything like that. That's just what popped in my head, and when I Googled it, this is what came up. But this is really the actual going south. This is Roald Amundsen's telegram to Robert Falcon Scott, September 9th, 1910, where he just very simply says, I'm going south. And you'll hear more on that momentarily. So first, discovery of Antarctica. It was theorized way back in Greek Roman times that there was a large southern continent, a large landmass in the southern hemisphere. And the idea was you've got a lot of land in the northern hemisphere. They liked symmetry a lot and all that. So there must be a large Antarctic mass or southern mass in the southern hemisphere to balance that out. So this is an old map. In this period, in many, many centuries, Ferdinand Magellan, who circumnavigated the world, he'd sailed through the Straits of Magellan, which is between the southern tip of South America and Tierra del Fuego, the islands right off of that. It's a narrow strait. I don't know, it seems, I have not sailed through there, but it seems like pretty obvious that it would just be a narrow strait between islands. But apparently he thought initially that he might have been seeing the southern continent be just below South America. And so you have this map that's obviously very rudimentary and not very accurate, but it shows a large Antarctic continent below. But obviously that was wrong. It was just the islands. When I was putting this together, I came across, I didn't actually realize this, but there's a story that a Polynesian, I'm going to mail the name, Hui Te may have navigated into Antarctic waters as early as around the 600s of the Common Era. And there was actually a paper written, Journal of Royal Society paper, and it was talked about in the press quite a bit back in actually just 2022. I don't really remember hearing about this. And they presented this evidence that there's these oral histories that suggests that they went to this place, the foggy, misty, dark place that's not seen by the sun. There's rocks that grow out of the sea. Those would maybe be icebergs. There was also like a white sea that they thought maybe sea ice, vegetation-free peaks. So it got a lot of press, but there's also a lot of skepticism of it. It just did not seem to a lot of scientists that it just did not seem plausible. The Polynesians they spread out around the entire Pacific, so they're great navigators. Sailed, rode long distances. So in terms of distance, it's not necessarily plausible, but crossing into the Southern Ocean, into cold waters, it seems like this was not very likely to have happened, that it was just legends, misinterpretation of some of the legends, that there or an exaggeration of that. And so it's probably not true, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. And this there's a lot of things about Antarctica and exploration that you hear about that are not necessarily true. And it's very fascinating. There's a lot of things. I'll talk about a couple of those as we go through. Okay. So, all right. So eventually, Antarctica was discovered. James Cook, who was famous for a lot of various things in the Pacific region, particularly. He was the first to sail south of the Antarctic Circle back in 1773. That's before the Declaration of Independence, even. He didn't actually see the continent, but he saw large tabular icebergs, and he figured that they must come from a pretty large landmass. So that was not confirmation, but certainly a very good indication that there was significant land down towards the South Pole. In 1820 was the first actual sighting by I really like this name, the Russian Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen. And then Mikhail Lazarus was captaining another ship with him. And so that's the first sighting of the continent. And Nathaniel Palmer, his first American, just a few months after that, actually. I think there was some controversy as to who sighted Antarctica first, whether it was the Americans or the Russians, but I think the evidence eventually came out that it was very clearly that the Russians were first. And then 1840 was the first real evidence that this is indeed a continent and a sizable continent. There was the French Dumont d'Urville who found coastline. He named it Adelie Land after his wife Adelie. That's where the name of the Adelie penguins come from. And Charles Wilkes, he mapped several hundred miles, about 1,500 miles of the coastline, and named it Wilkes Land. He actually didn't name it, but I just thought that was funny. The French are naming it after their wives, and the Americans are naming it after themselves. But it's actually other people named it after Wilkes later. So, but Wilkes was not a particularly nice guy. He had a reputation for being very stern. He was court-martialed at least once, and so there was some controversy around him. All right, geography. Just kind of a quick. Folks here probably are very familiar with this, but this is your typical your USA versus Antarctica map. And this is about 14 million square kilometers, about 1.5 times the size of the contiguous United States. 98% covered by ice, other than like the dry valleys that John mentioned last week and a few other little places. The average thickness of the ice is about 2 kilometers, almost 5 kilometers at its maximum. 25.6 million cubic kilometers of ice, which is hard to put your head around, but it's 61% of the fresh water on the earth, and if it melted, it would raise sea level about 58 meters, about 200 feet, 190 feet or so. So it's a big mass, lots of ice, as you know. This is just a map of the area. It's split into two halves, basically, the East Antarctic and the West Antarctic. The West Antarctic is largely below sea level in terms of the base, and so it's if you remove the ice, it would be ocean there with some islands, whereas East Antarctica is largely on solid land. There was actually a new mapping, which actually I realized I forgot to put that in. I was going to do that. That shows the base of the continent without the ice. And then just some names. There's Wilkes Land in the lower right there. That's named after him. This is just a few of the major names. There's lots of names. There's a lot of, you can get your name as a polar scientist if you have done something of note. You can get your name on something. There's a way that people can nominate you for ice creams and Kellen Fricker, who's ISAT-2 sciencing lead, she has, I forget what it is, some feature named after her. I think Ted Scambos has something named after him, yeah. So, I don't know, John, do you have anything named after you yet? No, okay, you should, we should come up with something.
Doesn't most of the fresh water come through the Weddell Sea? I think I learned that in one of my climates classes. No, not the case. Okay, I'm looking at John.
Yeah.
John is answering.
I can write a convincing letter.
Yeah. So, I have to put in a little bit of sea ice for myself here. And the point being here that, when you have the sea ice in the wintertime, it actually about doubles the size of a continent, in terms of ice covered area. So this is ice covered, of the ice covered ocean. It gets very low in the summertime in March and then expands out around the whole continent. And again, about doubles the size of the continent in the wintertime. All right, so going into the age of exploration and what's called the heroic age of exploration. Once the continent was discovered, there was a bit of a lull there, but by the late 1800s, there was this push towards getting to Antarctica and exploring Antarctica. There was one of the early ones was the Belgian expedition, led by this guy Adrian Gerlach. They were the first to overwinter south of the Antarctic Circle. Notably, the first mate on the expedition was Roald Amundsen, and then there was the Southern Cross, the British expedition. The British there were others. There were German expeditions, and this is not by any means a complete list, but the British were very much a big part of this in exploring the Antarctic. The Discovery Expedition was led by Robert F. Scott, who we'll hear a lot more about shortly. With Shackleton, they established the base at McMurdo, basically at McMurdo Sound. And so that's, that legacy is still around in the U.S. McMurdo Station. Shackleton, again, was on the crew. Shackleton then took the crew a few years later on the ship the Nimrod, and they got to past 88 degrees south, within about 100 miles of the pole. So they got pretty close. They used ponies. Very interesting thing that will come into play later. But the British liked horses.
The hut from South Discovery Expedition is still remodeled.
Yes,
It's still there.
yeah, the hut, they built the hut for that, and it was used for later expeditions, and it's still there. Yeah. All right, so the race to the South Pole, this was like the big thing at the time. It was going on really at the same time as the race for the North Pole to try to reach the two poles. And Amundsen, he was already well known. He had navigated the Northwest Passage a few years earlier, became the first to do that. He did a lot of exploration in the Arctic. He learned a lot from the indigenous communities. That's why he was successful in the Northwest Passage, or at least one of the major reasons, I would say. In terms of how to survive and how to work in the polar climates, for example, using sled dogs for transportation, getting the proper clothing that would keep you warm and also dry. And he planned to go to the North Pole in 1910. He went, he got a lot of funding from people, and was going to be the first person to get to the North Pole. But as he was doing this, the word came out that Perry and/or Cook, supposedly, I talked about last time whether they actually made it or not, but the news came out that they had made it to the North Pole. So the North Pole was accomplished. Amundsen's like, what's the point of going to the North Pole? So he decided to go to the South Pole. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't want to say anything because he was worried about his funders pulling money, for one reason. And so he told his brother and maybe one other person, I think, but the crew did not know. They got on the boat thinking they're going up into the Arctic and going to the North Pole. And then he said, nope, we're going to the South Pole. So we're doing a 180, but literally we're going 180 degrees from where they were intending to go. He actually, I think, told them, like, okay, we're still going to go to the North Pole, but we're just going to go to the South Pole first. So, a couple of years delay, no big deal. But anyway, and so at this time, Robert Scott was setting up to go to the South Pole. And Robert Scott's sitting there filling out, got his crew, okay, no problem, take our time, no big deal. And then he's in Australia, I believe, and he gets a telegram from Amundsen from Madeira, which is Canary Islands off the coast of Spain. And that's where the famous note, "I'm going south," one line. There is some say that it's actually the second line is the more accurate wording of it, which is "beg to inform you from proceeding," should be proceeding to the proceeding Antarctic. And so, no real explanation what he's doing, why he's doing it. But Scott knows that Amundsen is also going towards the south and going to the South Pole. So now we have a race between the two of them. So he got down and set up on the Bay of Whales. I'll show you that in a map in a moment. So Robert Falcon Scott, I think that's a cool middle name. Anyone wants a middle name for any kids, Falcon's a good one, I think. He was a British naval officer. He did the Discovery, as I mentioned, expedition. And he really focused, and the British were really focused on kind of not just accomplishing something, but doing something valuable and helpful to society through scientific discovery. So they were really focused on science, collecting observations, collecting samples of various things. They went around, they didn't get very close to the pole particularly. They discovered the Antarctic plateau, which is basically you come up, you have the ice shelf, and then you got to get up to the plateau, you have to go up a glacier. And that, no one had been up to the plateau until this Discovery expedition. And then the Terra Nova expedition was the one where he was going to the pole. This was kind of, they changed the focus a little bit. It really was aiming to reach the pole. But still focused a lot and still a desire to do scientific discovery. They used some dogs in the earlier expedition, but they didn't find them very helpful. They didn't really he didn't like the dogs, they didn't like dogs. And a lot of it was they didn't have the training in how to work with the dogs and how to train the dogs and how to work with the dogs. So these dogs are just, they're not very good. If you've been around an untrained dog, you know how that may be. So we kind of abandoned the idea of dogs, at least as a primary. They did have dogs on the Terra Nova expedition, but the really focused was on ponies, horses, and then also this new technology of motorized sledges, gasoline powered motorized sledges. They set up at Hut Point, which is McMurdo Sound, and that was about 69 miles farther from the pole than Amundsen's camp. So he's essentially behind before he even gets started at that point. All right, so Amundsen, these are the two journeys, and here's the map with the timeline there, and there's the Bay of Whales. So they're on opposite sides of the Ross Ice Shelf, essentially, and they're aiming, for the same goal. Amundsen had a team of 4 sledges, 52 dogs. What they do, this is simplified a bit. They lay depots. They had teams. There's a crew of like 20 people at least on these ships, and they would go out and they'd lay depots so that they would have supplies going and coming. So, it wasn't just the 4 or 5 people going all the way to the pole. They were doing these. It's like when you go to people that climb Mount Everest. There's the different camps at different levels, and so you kind of go on, and then the one team hopes to make it the whole way. And so they were doing all this. They actually did it over. This took a couple of years actually as they set everything up. But Amundsen basically really was like it cruised to the pole. Smooth, very smooth trip, no major problems. One of the things the actual Heiberg Glacier had not been traversed, so I think they didn't really know exactly how they were going to get up on the plateau, but they managed that without any problem. And arrived at the pole on 14th of December. 16 dogs. You notice they started with 52. And got there with 16. They returned with 11. And arrived back in Hobart in March of 1912. Said they had made it to the pole. So Scott left with horses, motorized sledges. The sledges didn't work, really. They lost one through the ice, as they were unloading it from the ship. Break down in the cold weather. They hadn't been really tested very well in the cold weather. The horses did not do well either. Several died from either the cold. A couple of them did fall through the ice as well and drown. And they had skis, and the skis, the weather was cold. So the skis didn't really, if you tried to cross country ski, if you don't have the right wax or something, you don't make very good progress. They almost essentially walked to the pole. Um, and, uh, and so they get there, almost a month after, or over a month after Amundsen, and they see the tent that Amundsen left in the flag. So yeah, that had to be pretty dispiriting, to realize that you were not first. And then they returned, headed back. I was going to show this. So this is the two pictures of the crews, or the teams at the pole. At the top is Amundsen. I think he's on the left there, looking up towards the Norwegian flag. And then this is the crew, Scott's crew. At the bottom, standing. Can't really see, but they were standing. The tent is behind them, and you kind of see the looks on their faces. They're not terribly happy. And of course, the thing is, they have to turn around and go back now. So, the return was much slower than they had hoped for, due to weather and other problems, illness with the team members. The depots were a little too far apart, it seemed like. And Scott died on the 29th or 30th of March. And let me do that. So Scott died, and all his team died, basically, or that went to the pole. There was five of them. Yeah, the five that went to the pole. The ones that there were, crew at the ship that were, and they were trying to get to them. They actually made it within 11 miles of a depot, and they couldn't quite get there. The strength was lost. There was one, Evans, I think, I should have wrote down the team members, but Evans, he fell and hurt his leg really badly, and died. Oh yeah, so I can go back to the map here. Oops. Yeah, so there's Evans, died, and then Oates died, a couple weeks before, and then Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, were the last three alive. And they were basically stuck in the tent, with a really bad blizzard, and they could not leave, and their food supplies had dwindled, and they were, not in good shape. So they basically were found, in the tent, the three of them. So when this happened, it actually made Scott kind of a hero. He gained the fame initially, more so, I would say, than Amundsen did. Part of that was he was British, and the British were the dominant country in they had the British Empire. It was kind of the height of the British Empire. But also the way he died, if you're gonna die a good death. And the way he and the team died, they were really seen as heroic, demonstrated the British spirit. They were stoic. They didn't whine and cry much. He did have a letter where he kind of made excuses a bit. This is a little bit of the final message at the bottom there, but I just clipped a little bit out of it, where, kind of beyond the excuses, he talks about, Englishmen can endure hardships and meet death with fortitude. So it has this great, strong, and very heroic message, basically. And, they're one of the famous quotes from Oates, who left the tent. So the four of them were in the tent, and they were stuck there. And Oates basically got up at one point and just said, there's this quote, "I'm just going outside and maybe sometime." And he did that because he recognized there was four of them, there wasn't enough food supply, he wasn't in as good shape. So he basically sacrificed himself. He just walked out into the Arctic and disappeared. And he did that to try to save the other three. So again, that kind of sacrifice was seen as very honorable. And so, and there's also Scott did things the right way, the British way. What's the right way? They focused on science. They were found with rock samples and some fossils in the tent. with them, so they had all this, even though they were struggling and running out of food, they still kept carrying that, they could have just done it, you know?
So worried about your computer.
And they didn't intentionally kill animals, as, there were animals that died. But Amundsen had talked about the dogs, and the number of dogs goes down. Well, that was because they were killing the dogs. Amundsen's view was like, the dogs serve a purpose. And, the great thing about dogs, I think the quote is, dogs eat dog. So they could take the dogs, and the dogs, they didn't need it, their supplies were going down, they didn't have as much weight, didn't need as many dogs to carry them. Well, you feed the dogs to the dogs. And so you don't have to carry things. Even like at the camp, it was good because the dogs would eat seal and penguins. Horses don't eat seals or penguins. So Scott had to bring like hay and all the supplies. So it's kind of morbid, but it makes some sense in terms of efficiency. But I think at this time as well, but it's in that time, you don't kill animals needlessly, or it was seen as needlessly. So the British were kind of not happy about that, and seen as Amundsen kind of, it's almost like Amundsen cheated or something, something like that. So but a couple decades go by, and there's kind of a reassessment of Scott, and he really did do some what you might say dumb things. He had a lot of hubris. He had his way of doing things was not adapting well. Again, using the horses and sleds, using untested motorized sleds, like why would you do that? He placed the depots too far apart. He basically said, okay, I think we can do, I forget what the distance is. And so we'll put the depots that far away, instead of saying like, maybe we should have a margin of safety if things don't go exactly as planned. And Amundsen actually did that. He put the depots closer together. So he was making the assumption of optimal conditions instead of preparing for the worst. There was 5 of them that made it to the pole. And he made a last minute decision to take 5. It was originally going to be 4. And I think he couldn't decide between which 2, and I forget which 2 it is offhand. And so he decided to take both. And, that was like not making the hard decision. And now you've got 5 people you need supplies for instead of only 4. And, that contributed to it. And, even the science part, it's admirable, but like, what are you doing, carrying these rocks and stuff back when you're trying to survive? It really doesn't make sense to prioritize, science over safety. And this view, I think, was really came out after this book by Roland Huntford, The Last Place on Earth, that talked about Scott and this, and kind of was more critical on that. So then, more recently, there was like a reassessment of Scott. And this was in a book by The Coldest March by Susan Solomon, people may be familiar with. She was at NOAA, and she's well known for
He spoke here.
yeah, she did a seminar, and she's well known for discovering why the ozone hole in Antarctica, and that's some of the science I might talk about next time. But she wrote this book, and she delved into like a lot of the meteorological records and all the data and observations, and realized that there was a lot of bad luck. The conditions were not great, even right from the start. It was colder than they expected. They couldn't use the ponies as early as they wanted to start laying depots. And because it was too cold, whereas the dogs, it was fine for the dogs, for Amundsen. Again, I talked about the skis not working well on the cold, so that was partly due to the snow just being cold. And then they hit this storm that basically closed them in. They couldn't make any progress for several days until they died. And they were only 11 miles from depot, which is, on a decent day's hike or ski, that they could do that within a day, basically. So it's I did read this book, and it's a pretty interesting book. It really gets into a lot of the data and science, and basically, that February, March period when they were trying to get back from the pole was far outside the normal range of what you would see in terms of weather in that area. All right, so the next one is Shackleton and the Endurance. And So, South Pole had been reached, so what else is there to do? Well, Shackland comes up with the idea of being the first to go across the entire continent, not just go to the South Pole and turn around, keep going and get to the other side. And so he left on August 8th, 1914, which is an interesting date because World War II had just begun. Just a little more than a week before, and just a few days after Britain had declared war. So you got this war, and he actually, this was before they had left, civilization, and so he actually, talked to the British, the government, and said, "Hey, you need the ship. If we can cancel this. We will not go on this expedition." But they told him keep going. I think there was, well, one of the main reasons was, yeah, it's going to be a short war. It's not a big deal. So we don't really need this. So, and also I think, the pride and the British pride too, that even during war they were going. So, this is a little quote here. This is an ad that he supposedly put in a newspaper. Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success. So, but this is one of those myths that, is not, very likely not true. Someone came up with this. There was actually people put out a reward to can you actually find this in a newspaper? And no one has been able to find it in any archives. So this is very likely not true, but it makes for a good quote. And there was one more crew member that was on, and that's Mrs. Chippy. Mrs. Chippy was a cat, brought on board by the Harry McNish, whose nickname was Chippy. So they named the cat Mrs. Chippy. Apparently, after they got the cat on board and left, they realized it was a male. So it was really more of a Mr. Chippy, but they kept the name, so it's Mrs. Chippy. I'm not sure exactly why they brought the cat. I mean, one reason would be for rats or mice that might have gotten on the ship. I think that was not uncommon to have a cat. But McNish really liked the cat, so I don't know if he just brought it along. But the cat would run around, climb the mast. It did fall off the ship at one point, and they actually turned around and saved the cat. So the cat was a pretty iconic part of the crew. There's a picture of Mrs. Chippy there it's not McNish, but it's one of the other crew members.
There's a book that's written from the cat's perspective.
Yeah, I do have that. Yeah, yes, that's coming. So okay, so what was called the Trans-Antarctic Expedition, 1914. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, hopefully, but this is basically the route, and I'm starting at number 4 there at the bottom. So they sailed in, and number 3 there at the top is South George Island, where they briefly stopped. They went in and they were trying to get to I think it's the Bay of Whales there, where Evanston was, anyways, they got beset in the ice. So the ship froze in, they could not move any further. And then they started drifting with the ice. This is one of the cool things about this expedition, I think, is there's a lot of photos. And this guy, Frank Hurley, who is considered, I think, one of the great early photographers. He came along and brought his photographs, his cameras and so forth, and took lots of really great photos, which will be shown here. And hold on. Just gotta get some. Oh, maybe not. Okay. All right. So, oops, did I go too far? Okay. Oops, I spoiled a little bit. So anyway, the Endurance, it drifted along with the ice. This is kind of like typical ice drift is. And eventually, unfortunately, though, the ship got crushed in the ice. The ice closed in on the ship, started crushing it. They abandoned the ship to what they called the ocean camp. And a few weeks, well, about 3 weeks later, the ship sank actually. And so now they're on the ocean and again floating with the ice. and then they get to, 7, up towards the peninsula. Now the ice is breaking up, so they have to abandon, the camp. They did salvage the lifeboats, fortunately, so they were able to get into the lifeboats. And, but these are pretty small lifeboats, they're not particularly navigable. But they were able to get to this really small island off the tip of Antarctica called Elephant Island, uninhabited, nothing there, really in the middle of, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. And really no hope of rescue from there. They're not near shipping lanes, but they're on dry land at least. There were penguins and seals around, so they could feed themselves. But it was not somewhere you'd want to stay for too terribly long, and really there was no hope of rescue at that location. So Shackleton and 5 others, they took kind of the best lifeboat, which was called the James Caird. And you can see it there. There's the 6 of them actually getting in the boat. This is another photograph by Hurley. You can see the size of this thing. It's not very big. They reinforced it. They put a top on it, put masts on so they could sail it. And the idea was that they were going to try to sail to South Georgia, which is here. And so they left like on April 24th. They sailed across South Georgia Island and managed it there about 10th of May. It was really amazing because the GPS went out for a couple days. So this is remarkable. They had no GPS. They one of them was a navigator that went along, and so they had the sextant, and so they could take some measurements. But you're on a rough sea. It was cloudy a lot, so they were doing a lot of like dead reckoning. South Georgia Island's a decent sized island. Let's see, do I have it here? Yeah. Yeah. A decent sized island. It's fairly long, but when you're unsure of your actual position and how well you're able to track, it's, you're trying to hit a target. And the thing is if the winds and the currents are going, kind of clockwise here. And so if you miss it, you're going around, there's nothing else around. For at least quite a while. So if you miss it, you're done, basically. So they've got to hit South Georgia Island. And again, remarkably, they were able to navigate and get to South Georgia Island. And they landed where the X is there. And so, they successfully got to land, but unfortunately, they're on the kind of the west side or the southwest side. All the ports, all the civilizations on the right side, there's whaling stations there. And so they're again kind of in the middle of nowhere. And so even though this was basically, they're considered the greatest open sail ever done, over 800 miles, and they managed to land there. But they, again, were in this pretty abandoned area, and with the way the winds and currents and the capabilities of the little lifeboat, they were not confident that they could sail around the island to get to one of the harbors. And there was the crew of 6, there's 3 of them were not in great shape either. So they were not sure if they could handle any more sailing. So Shackleton and a couple of the others, they basically decided, well, we're going to have to hike. So we're going to hike from the one side of South Georgia Island to the other. And you're like, well, okay, it's a little bit of hike, no big deal. But this is what it looks like. And so you go, oh, okay. Well, pull out our topographic map, find out where we're going. No, they didn't have any maps. This was unmapped. So they were doing this completely blind. So they basically hiked across this. They realized that they had to go as fast as they could, and so they went 36 hours straight to get to the whaling station. And then so the 3 of them made it. And really, people in the whaling station were like, who the heck are you? There was also, Shackleton gets there, and it's, about 2 years after they had left, and said, yeah, hey, how'd that war turn out? And they're like, the war's still going on. Anyways, so they were able to get a ship to get around the other side of the island, powered ship, rescue the other 3 very quickly. Now they got to get back to save the rest of the crew. It took a while. They had trouble finding a ship and getting in. They got one that went out there and they couldn't get through because of the ice. And then, it's the war, so there's not as many things available. So it took like almost over 3 months to get a ship to get back and rescue the remaining 22 of the crew. So yeah, it took 4 attempts. And they finally got back to civilization in Punta Arenas in Chile. And again, World War I is still raging. So, there was, you imagine that you go through this travail and you get back, and now it's like the British are like, oh, we've got about 28 people we can we can just go to the war. So several of them did. A couple were killed, and a few more were injured. Frank Hurley joined the war effort as a photographer, took war photographs. And there are several books. These are kind of the three, I would say, iconic ones. I've read the Caroline Alexander one, which I think is really good. It's not like super detailed, but it tells the story really well. Has a lot of Frank Hurley's photographs. The Alfred Lansing one is much more detailed. And then there's Chaplin, who wrote his own account of it, essentially his own.
I've got the second one. I think I've got it in my office.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, so, but, they're all good, but I really like the Carolyn Alexander one. And as John mentioned, there is a book about Mississippi, and Mississippi, this was also by Carolyn Alexander, kind of an association. It's basically the expedition told from Mississippi's viewpoint. So Mississippi is the narrator of the story. And unfortunately, as we were aware, Mississippi came to a bad end, along with all the dogs. This is in the book. They did it nicely. Like they ended where he's just kind of hanging out and enjoying his last day. He doesn't really realize what's going to happen. So it doesn't end on a sad note, unfortunately. But basically, after they abandoned the ship, they really, again, this is one of those things that's sad, but they had to make a choice. That they can't keep anything extraneous around if they want to try to survive. Anything that cannot pull its weight or is not useful must be put down. So that was Shackleton. McNish was really upset about this, and basically he never forgave Shackleton, as the story goes. In New Zealand, in Wellington, there's a cemetery where McNish is buried, and they have a little statue, a little sculpture of Mississippi. So yeah. And kind of an update to the story. I didn't have a chance to get into much detail, but you may have heard they did find actually the Endurance. They went down and found it on the bottom of the ocean, about 3,000 meters below the ocean. So in this group that Falls Heritage Trust, and it's being left there as like a more just like the Titanic. Now that's the story everyone knows about Shackleton and the expedition. But there's another part of this, so the Shackleton and the Endurance, they all survived, which is again a really remarkable thing. The closest thing I think one can come to it would be like Apollo 13 in terms of getting the crew back and successfully, at least by tremendous challenges. But there is the other side of the story. With going across the Antarctic, they needed a ship to pick them up on the other side. They weren't going to turn around and go back. And they also needed, supplies. So there's the ship, the Aurora, came from the other side, and sailed into the Ross Sea. And the goal, again, was to pick them up, but also lay supplies, put depots out that they could, so they would have supplies as they came. And this was not as successful. They got in, people got off, they got supplies off, but then the Aurora got pulled away. There was like a storm, I think, and drifted away in the ice. And they couldn't get back in. So now the crew was kind of like, well, we don't have a ship. We're just going to be sitting here. They laid depots, but they didn't, they had scurvy. There was 3 deaths from various reasons. The Aurora it had damage, had to return to Hobart. Eventually it got back and they were able to rescue the remaining crew there. And then they got back to Hobart and actually reunited with Shackleton. So this part of the expedition doesn't really get talked about very much, and it wasn't quite successful as far as bringing everyone back. Yeah.
Is that a dog?
Yes, that is a dog. Yeah.
Did he survive?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't
Not
know.
still.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
most of the animals haven't fared well in these stories so far.
Yeah.
At least he wasn't on a Norwegian expedition, so he wasn't gonna get fed to other dogs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Poor thing.
Yeah, okay, moving towards, well, not so much science, but a little bit of politics here, and actually still some discovery here. That was kind of the heroic age of exploration, but the exploration continued, but in a more, I would say, governmental, organized fashion. And really, the main character here is Admiral Byrd, Richard Byrd. And he established, this is in 1928, so it's a few years later. There was a little bit of a gap. I mean, there was the war and so forth, but the US in particular, like, we need to start exploring the Antarctic more. So they established this base called Little America in the Ross Sea Shelf near Bay of Whales, so near where Amundsen was camped. They built an airstrip and actually brought a plane down. And Byrd actually made the first flight over the South Pole in 1929. 19 hour round trip. I'm not sure it was this trip or another, but there was one of his flights. They did several flights to map in areas of the continent. There was one where they were trying to go over I think the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, and they had too much weight. And they were throwing food and supplies out the airplane to try to make sure they got enough lift, and barely made it. So it was, yeah, it was still pretty dangerous there. He overwintered at a remote meteorological station, like 125 miles or so from like the main camp. They wanted to get, just a different location to get different map data in a different area. I think the idea was there was gonna be like 3 of them there, but then they only had enough supplies for 2. And so Byrd said, forget it, I'm just gonna do it myself. So Byrd overwintered by himself in this station. He almost died from carbon monoxide poisoning. They very awesome. I think there are stories of him kind of going slightly crazy. I don't know if that's whether because of the carbon monoxide or just being alone for that long. But he did survive, and then there was other expeditions kind of carried on 33, 35 for Little America 2, Little America 3, right on the eve of World War I, or the Americans' entry into World War I, or World War II, I mean. And then after the war, there's Little America 4, which was renamed or also called Operation High Jump. This was a major foray into the Antarctic by the US. About 4,700 men, 25 aircrafts, 13 ships. It was a military operation, testing equipment in cold areas. It really, establishing a US influence. This was the start of the Cold War. World War II had just ended. During World War II, there was some, talk of, the Germans being in Antarctica, and, what this might have some strategic value during the Cold War, particularly. So they did large charting areas, charted large areas of Antarctica. And Byrd was in command of this as well. I forgot to mention there's Marie Byrd Land, which is near, and that was named after Byrd's wife. So there's there is precedent for Americans doing that too. But this led to a lot of rumors later on that there was Nazi hideouts that they were searching for because the military was involved. Also that there were space aliens, that were there that they were hiding. So there's been rumors about that obviously are not true. Then there was a later one called Operation Deep Freeze, and that was in 1956, and that was kind of tying into what was the upcoming International Geophysical Year, which is a big international exploration, science and exploration of geophysics, and that really established the permanent stations, the McMurdo, South Pole Amundsen Scott Station, as well as other stations in US and other stations. In 1956, the first aircraft landed at South Pole. So that was deemed to be the first people since Robert Scott and his team were there in 1912. So this led to the signing of the Antarctic Treaty. John talked about this a little bit. The idea of there's at this time, there was a lot of countries going on there. There were these territorial claims. It's probably a little hard to see up there, but these wedges of territorial claims that various countries had made. And so they came up with this Antarctic Treaty, and the idea was to kind of, there was recognition like we need to make this a peaceful, make this, an area for peace, science, and not be fighting wars over this. So it signed this treaty, many countries, and the main things, peaceful purposes, freedom of scientific investigation. Also, it mentions, which I didn't realize, free exchange of scientific observations and results. So they were doing open science way back then. Protection of the environment, and they later added like a prohibition on mineral resources. And then they didn't renounce their territorial claims, but no one takes action on them. So there's this kind of, interesting, the claims are still kind of technically there, but no one's going in and claiming it. But there's interesting aspects there, like I think John, you mentioned, like the US put the station at the South Pole. And with the idea is, you can see there are like wedges, longitudinal wedges. You're at the South Pole, you have all the longitudes, and so that was part of there. And then the Russians went to Vostok, which was the cold pole or the pole of inaccessibility, the farthest from the coastline. There's some story I remember hearing and reading somewhere, and I haven't been able to find it, so it's very likely not true, but that the US kind of tricked the Russians or the Soviets into taking Vostok instead of the South Pole. They're like, oh yeah, you want to go to Vostok, it's a really cool place, and the South Pole is kind of boring, there's no point in being there. But I think that's apocryphal. But anyway, so that's been in effect and still is in effect in the as we carry on, and it's largely kept that it's only scientists are allowed to be there officially. There are tourists that go there, but they don't necessarily get to get supported there. So everything I've talked about to now is with men, and men were the primary explorers. But women in Antarctica have become more prominent, and there are many first women see Antarctica back in the 1930s. The early ones basically were with their husbands, and so that was really the only way for women to get to Antarctica for quite some time. And then in the 70s, first women to winter over at a U.S. station, so it started to slowly change. Nowadays, I think I wouldn't say there's no issues, but it's a lot more equitable. John, you can speak to this much better than I can, or Kara as well from your experience. But I did want to at least mention this because it was very much a male dominated, and maybe in some ways still is, but women have played important roles in that, and then African Americans as well. It's also a white male dominated area for many years. George Washington Gibbs Jr. was the first African American in Antarctica. You may have heard of him through Leilani Henry, who folks know. She gave a talk, suppressor, I think it's about a year ago, along with Ted Scambos, which was really interesting, called The Call of Antarctica. So she's the daughter of George Gibbs, and wrote a really nice book on his experiences there. And then the first African American woman to reach the South Pole was just back in 2011, Barbara Hillary. And so I think, let's see, yeah, pretty much at time. So I think I will just leave it here with that, with the coming soon for part 2. So thanks.